Hi, welcome to American Black History. Knowledge and opinions of Africans has been colored over the years by information we got from missionaries and explorers. During the 1800s, Americans were very intent upon sending missionaries to their heathen brethren. And when the great explorer Henry M. Stanley wrote of his African experiences, he titled it In Darkest Africa. The famous 19th century missionary David Livingstone believed that he was taking the gospel to a backward and very benighted people. But in more recent years, American knowledge of Africa all too often has been influenced by movies and myths. Even our famous writer Alex Haley, who wrote Roots, sometimes suggests a very scantily clad people living in a jungle. So just how much of this ignorance about Africa remains? Well, it wasn't until the mid-20th century that American scholars began writing about Africa with any knowledge and sensitivity. And I can't stress the diversity of Africans enough. Do you have any idea of the vastness of the continent? As you can see, here is the Mediterranean. Here is the Atlantic. Here is Saudi Arabia and the Red Sea. And it's just a huge area. And it's, excuse me, it's not one large nation. It's scores of different states and different cultures and languages. And each one of them has a varying degree of technology and expertise. Some have the view that early Africa was backward and uncivilized, whereas others had the romantic vision of a pastoral state, where everybody would have lived happily ever after and tended their little gardens, said the evil white Europeans had not arrived. Well, which is the truth? There is some truth to both visions. While when the Europeans arrived, they did find some states that had Iron Age agricultural technology, and some states were very heavily involved in the gold trade, even as early as the 10th century AD. But before we get into our text material, I want to spend a few minutes on generalities and background. And then I'm going to start way back in time. Now, when someone asks you, what do you know about Africa? And I firmly believe you need to look at any subject you're going to study at the background to get some idea. And so before we can look at the history of slavery in the United States, we have to look at the homeland of the slaves. So when someone asks you about Africa, and I know it's just a rhetorical question, you can't possibly answer me. But of course, everyone's heard of Egypt. And of course, we all know that slaves came from Africa and that Africa has a lot of desert. And because of the recent news in the last few decades, we are well aware of the Muslim religion over there. And if you have had any type of biology course, you know of the theory of the life beginning in Africa. But do you know where the name Africa comes from or what it means? Well, it's kind of lost in the past, but we scientists and historians believe that it's either from the Greco-Roman time when the Romans referred to their colonial province in Tunisia and eastern Algeria as Africa. And we believe it's from a word meaning sunny. Now, Africa, A-P-R-I-C-A, in Latin or Greek means without cold. Now, both would describe the weather conditions there. Or it could have been in the Semite, which refers to the area as a land of ears of corn. Whatever the word, the interior was called dark or black, primarily because of the unknown and the color of the skin of the inhabitants. Africa, some general information. It is the second largest continent in the world, with over 11 million plus square miles. There's more than 53 plus countries in it, and the largest, of course, being Egypt and Sudan. The highest point there is Mount Kilimanjaro, which is over 19,000 feet high. Lake Victoria is the largest lake, 26,000 square miles. And of course, the Nile River is the longest river, 4,241 miles. You've got the Congo and the Niger and the Zambezi rivers, but they're small, but they're large compared to what you've got elsewhere. And you've got, of course, the Sahara Desert, which is the largest in the world, over 3 million square miles. Of course, it's located in northern Africa, and they do have a desert in the south called the Kalahari. It's very hot there, too. So you have a little bit of background of the continent. Let me introduce you to some words. Afrocentrism. It basically means an outlook or worldview centered on Africa and the descendants of African peoples, much the way European centrism is centered on Europe and Europeans. And it often includes a revisionist theory that recasts world history from an African point of view, such as insisting that the Greek philosopher Aristotle stole his philosophy from Egypt, that Cleopatra was black and Socrates was black. And there's also the claim that it was the Egyptians that invaded Greece, not Greece that invaded Egypt. But Afrocentrism in a more radical form is often connected with the black supremacy movement, which includes the notion that the African contributions to world history and culture and race are superior to the contribution of peoples from any other race or continent. So how did it come about and why? There's so many different cultures on the continent of Africa, and there's many different shades of skin color as well as different languages. But my personal viewpoint is that it began back in the 18th and 19th century, brought on by the European imperialism and racism. And it continued on in the United States as a way to instill black pride in the early 20th century. Of course, there's a historical debate about that, just as there is over, well, say the United States Constitution. Some say the United States Constitution is a racial document written by white slave owners. Some say it was written by wealthy, educated men who were trying to do the best for all of our people. But now, whichever side of the argument you're on, you're sure you're right. And that's okay. Because if everyone had the same opinion, it would be a very boring world, folks. So why did I even bring it up? And I'm sure most of you heard some of those claims, and we're not here to debate, prove, or disprove any of them. We're here to study the history of African Americans and slavery. To get into that other discussion, you have to devote the entire class to studying ancient African history inclusively. But now that being said, do you recognize this man, Carter Wilson? Actually, he's Dr. Carter G. Whitson. Now, this young man was the child of slaves, and he spent his childhood working in eastern Kentucky coal mines. He didn't go to high school until he was 20 years old, but then he graduated in 2 years and went on to study at Harvard, where he actually earned a PhD. Now, while he was there, he was a little, shall we say, disturbed to discover that the history books he studied largely ignored the presence of any black Americans. And when they did figure into the picture, it was always in a very inferior social position. So he decided to do something about it. And he began writing Black Americans into American history. He established the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in 1915. A few years later, he founded the Journal of Negro History. In 1926, he launched the Negro History Week as a way of trying to bring national attention to the contribution of the black peoples throughout American history. And of course, it has now become a month-long celebration. He chose the second week of February because it marks the birthday of two very great men who influenced the black American population, Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, who both had birthdays then. On February the 22nd, 1868, Mr. W.E.B. Du Bois was born, very important civil rights leader and one of the original founders of the NAACP. February the 3rd, 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed, granting blacks the right to vote. February the 25th, 1870, the first black U.S. Senator, Senator Hiram Revels, took oath of office. February the 12th, 1909, the NAACP was founded by a group of very concerned black and white citizens in New York City. February the 21st, 1965, Malcolm X was shot to death by 3 black Muslims. And I'm sure if we looked, we'd find an awful lot more. But let me give you a little background on the continent. Before I get started, you've probably heard me say BC or BCE. Now, BCE means before Common Era, which is the same as BC or before Christ. CE is the Common Era. It's the same as after death. Now, both of BC and AD are directly connected to the Christian religion. And to be politically correct, we don't want to insult anyone, the Muslims or the Jews or any other religion. So we try to find something that would give you the same idea without using Christianity. So consequently, we'll say BCE and CE. But at any rate, tens of thousands of years ago, Africa was not the arid desert we think of as today. It wasn't until about 4,000 years before Common Era that a climate change caused the fertile Sahara region to lose its fertility. And the rivers that were there began to dwindle and dry up. Lakes began to disappear, and the people, of course, moved elsewhere. So you begin to see a separation of the peoples of Africa. Those that remained in the north around the Mediterranean Sea and along the western and eastern coast were to end up having contact with the Europeans and the Muslims. And of course, they would incorporate some of their different ideas and culture into their own life. But those in the center and further south of Africa developed their own cultures. So the Sahara began to become what I guess you call a major barrier to humans about the same time that the people began to move around and multiply. So this barrier is going to greatly influence how the humans developed in Africa. And although contact never stopped completely, you hear today about the contacts along the Red Sea in Egypt and the areas that the Rome conquered, but you don't hear an awful lot about the other side of the Sahara. There was prosperity in the north. They even had chariots and there was a culture, but when most people think of Africa of the past, they think of black men running around half naked, throwing spears, and having no law or civilization. Now we're going to completely shatter that idea. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that if the Sahara had not developed and grown, that Africa would have developed along the same lines as the Europe and the Mediterranean area, because the very nature of the continent and the forms of the vegetation have imposed a rather unique pattern of development now and would have anyway. So let's take a little brief look at civilizations and how they developed. Why did early civilizations always seem to appear like in the Near East along the Nile Valley, and in Mesopotamia along the Tigris and Euphrates River? River valley cultivation seems to be the clue. Because the earliest civilizations all began their rise in great river valleys, and no matter how much they were different in culture, custom, or religion, they all had irrigation and soil renewals from floods. So once man was able to stop all the hunting and gathering and end his nomadic life and begin to grow crops, he began to have surplus food. And with surplus food, there would grow trade and commerce. And with trade and commerce, there comes a type of permanent settlement and a division of labor. You begin to see the growth of cities and a central government. And south of the desert, which was severed from the communication with the civilizations of the ancient world, things went a little differently. The conditions of the river valley settlement, decisive in the Middle East and India and even China, did not appear because they had very, very few rivers, and the ones they did have were not large. So the early peoples of Central and Southern Africa did not develop the surplus food that would begin the chain of events. The tribes lived off the land and continued hunting and gathering, and when the need arose, they just simply moved to a different area. But of course, the people of the continental Africa over the past 1,500 years or so is a lot different than the people we know today. The people of Africa, unknown for centuries except for a few adventurous souls that traveled south. And of course, the stories these people brought back, I mean, let's be honest about it, they were a little bit exaggerated to glorify their own experience. So it's only been in the last few decades that serious attention has been paid to African history. For centuries, Africa was known as the Dark Continent and a land of fabulous golden legends, because, I mean, I'm sure you've all heard the story of King Solomon's mines and the treasures of Timbuktu. If I remember right, even Indiana Jones had a movie about it. But in the past 200 years, the glittering legends were replaced by a rather different type of belief. And that was that Africa is a land without a past or history. Its people had always lived in savagery. And the numerous and impressive archaeological traces of early African civilization were either ignored or attributed to a lost people. For instance, when the Europeans first arrived in our state of Kentucky, they saw all those beautiful mounds that had been built by the Mississippian Indians. And they said, well, the Indians didn't have the intelligence or the know-how, so it had to be a race of lost white men, either the lost Atlanteans or maybe it was a lost tribe of Israel. So these white Europeans were a little bit sanctimonious. If you weren't white and European, you just didn't have any civilization. But let me assure you, there was a civilization in Africa. It was highly developed and purely African in origin and character. And although I would love to spend a lot more time learning about African history, it's beautiful and it's mysterious, but we just don't have the time. We need to learn about the origins of the Africans before they became slaves, but we can't go much further than that. But of all the Earth's continents, oh, I'm sorry, this word listing, I'll leave it up here for a few minutes because these are words you're going to hear in the lecture. These are words you read in the text, and I can guarantee you they will either be the answer to a question or they will be used in a question. So you need to be familiar with these words in particular. Of all the Earth's continents, Africa really provides us with the longest, deepest record of humans. And as I said before, it's been theorized that Africa is the cradle of humankind. And archaeological records document the development of the different regional groups of people with their own technologies and their own local culture. The long and complex prehistory record extends far beyond the reach of written historical records or even oral traditions. And these things help shape the ethnic identity of modern-day African people. Now, after more than 60 million years of evolution, there is evidence in East Africa dating more than 4 million years ago of upright walking ancestors. By approximately 2.5 million years ago, we have evidence of behavior patterns, which we call the Stone Age. Now, that age is usually divided into early, middle, and late. In early, there were rapid changes in tools and behavior patterns, and beginning approximately 100 to 150,000 years ago. Now, we do not know for absolute certain, of course not. We don't have any written records. We have to deal with archaeological finds and surmise. And everything indicates that the people were still hunters and gatherers and doing some scavenging. And we see evidence of that all over the continent of Africa. But between 5,000 and 4,000 years BCE, we know that food production in the form of agriculture began and herding was introduced in Africa. Now, herding is simply a fancy word for keeping groups of cows or pigs or something. We believe that these came from the Near East areas. We know that iron technology was introduced sometime within the first millennium BCE from the Mediterranean area. And it wasn't long before the Africans started developing their own techniques. Ironworking began to spread to West Africa by the 1st century BCE. Ironworking centers developed and large populations would form around these centers. And these large cities would become chiefdoms or kingdoms of a very stratified social order. They'd be very complex divisions of labor and craft specializations, very well-developed artistic traditions, and there'd even be long-distance trade and sometimes campaigns of conquest. So food production and ironworking spread to Central and Southern Africa within the last 2,000 years. Iron-using food producers began to replace stone-using hunter-gatherers, except in those regions in Central and Southern Africa that was just suited for nothing but agriculture. Between 10 and 20,000 years ago, diverse later Stone Age populations in Africa began to, shall we say, exploit specific plants and animals that were available in their own regions. Hunting was focused on a few specific animals and wild plant gathering on a particular plant type. They used big old long sickle blades to cut grasses, and grinding stones were used to process grains. They've been found, especially in Northeast Africa, dating back at least 10,000 years. There is no evidence of this domestication of wild plant life in the Nile Valley during this time. A domestication involves the breeding of a species until its characters become altered from the wild state, bringing the animal more into line with what the human beings needed. Now, Egypt wasn't necessarily the first, remember. But a number of populations during this later Stone Age began to appear to have adopted some type of domestication with local plants. And some of the examples that would be given would be yams, which we call sweet potatoes, rice, millet, sorghum, and oil plants. They had sheep and goats and cattle and camels. They were imported from Asia. And by the way, it has nothing to do with anything, but the donkey and the cat were first domesticated in Egypt. And as strange as it may seem to us now, a very important region of food production in prehistory Africa was the Sahara Desert region. Because after the last glaciation, there was a period of rainfall and lower evaporation in that region that lasted almost 4,000 years. The Sahara supported a good-sized population around its lakes, which were very numerous in the ponds and rivers, and the people around 6500 BCE developed pottery. Now, we're not going to go into too much detail on the development of Egypt or the Sudan to the south, both along the Nile River, because our primary interest lay at the west coast of Africa. But just to mention a few things, we do know that cattle was domesticated and spread south of the Sahara about 3 to 4,000 BCE. And we did find pottery and ground stone axes in West Africa starting between 5 and 4,000 BCE. But as far as technology is concerned, the making of tools out of copper and bronze developed in West Africa before 3000 BCE, but never took hold in other parts of Africa except in a very few northern regions. Iron smelting technology was introduced to North Africa with the Phoenicians around the 8th century BCE. Semitic-speaking people immigrated from southern Arabia into Ethiopian highlands during the first millennium BCE, and by the 1st century CE had established an extensive state reaching across much of Ethiopia and Sudan, or in Central and North Africa. Meanwhile, Egypt had come under the influence of the Greeks and then the Romans about 30 BCE, and Christianity began to move into northern Africa and spread by the 4th century. Christian villages flourished even after the expansion of the Muslim Arabs into northern Africa and cutting them off from the more northern centers of Christianity. But the Arabian invasion in the 7th century caused a lot of change. And Islam rapidly took hold of much of northern Africa, especially the west part. And using camel caravans going south, the Arabians spread Islam to much of the sub-Saharan Africa. They developed networks that began to involve local Iron Age societies, and they created large urban centers with centralized political power that regulated and controlled the trade. The networks first involved the people of the Savannah region in the south of the Sahara. For the mid-8th century, there was a powerful state of Ghana, then Mali, then Songhai. And that's where we will begin in our text. Everything prior to this is not in your text. That first chapter is really very short. As a matter of fact, all the chapters in this textbook are short. And we will go over the chapter, but the lectures will get longer and you'll have more things to do. Since this is the first week of classes, we don't want to overload you too much. You're trying to learn where to go sit and study, and when to do things, and when to leave for school, and how soon can you get your children to the babysitter or get home from work, whatever. It takes a week or two to get settled in. So we're going to go easy with you the first week. It's a short chapter. I think it's about 11 or 12 pages long. And you have no other reading to do but this and answer those 3 questions. But as your chapter indicates, Ghana was the first we're going to cover. And we're going to cover 3 major states and mention a few other ones. Now, of course, you do realize that the use of the word state does not indicate a state like Kentucky is a state. State in this sense simply means a specific area of territory that has an organized body of people who rule, usually one that is a sovereign or a king or a chief. So the area of the west coast of Africa is where we're going to be studying. And most of these settlements were along the Senegal and Upper Niger rivers. As a matter of fact, that's where civilization began for most peoples, as I said earlier, along the rivers. Because they could be used for transportation, they could be used as a source of food and protection. And in the earliest beginnings, the territorial boundaries of Ghana were only very loosely defined. Now, we have no written evidence, but there is oral tradition that Ghana's existence began back in the early Christian era. As for the leaders, it seems that the offices were hereditary, and their social order came together and became very organized. As for the villages and towns, the natives of Ghana were farmers, and so were farmers until the droughts caused the desert to extend into their lands. But before the drought, because of abundant crops and sheep and cattle, they maintained a very healthy trade with other people and areas, and their main town was Kubi Sale. At about the 10th century Common Era, in other words, the 900s, the Muslim influence began to show up. And the religion was gradually adopted, and some people say it's because of the Muslim faith recognizes the nationality of the child by the nationality of the father. So the child born of a mixed marriage would have become Arabian and Muslim, whereas in America, the status of the mother would determine the status of the child. And some say it's because under the Muslim law you could have more than one wife. There's many theories. Maybe they just found the Muslim religion beautiful. But under the Muslim influence, the power of Ghana grew and expanded. Now, these Muslims, they brought not only a different religion, but they brought a different way of doing business. Excuse me. Where most trading had been done by a system of barter prior to their arrival, the Muslims demonstrated how to trade up for better and different goods. And isn't there a TV show about that, trading up? I think so. But they were teaching them how to trade up for gold and ivory and textiles and brass and pearls and salt and slaves. And by the 10th century, the king of Ghana was a Muslim, and because of this lucrative trade, had become the leader of a rather large army. And it was under the Sisi dynasty that Guyana reached the peak of power. Other tribes paid tribute to Guyana, and she began to use gold to trade with the Moroccan caravans, which is the country just on the upper north and western part of Africa. And according to your text, the cities of Baghdad and Cairo were even discussing what was going on in Ghana. Now, your text picks Tinkamenon in the 11th century to demonstrate how wealthy, because of tributes and taxes, Ghana had become. So this ruler lived in a fortified castle that had windows decorated by artists and beautiful pictures and sculptures. The grounds were gardens very lush that housed temples and where the native gods were worshipped. And they were even decorating the tombs of the former leaders very lavishly. The king was the head of the religion, or the chief priest. Of course, that was before the Muslim influence. And it was during his reign that a band of Muslims called the Almoravids invaded, seized the capital, and introduced their religion to the people. Anytime you're invaded, there's turmoil. And the conflict resulting from this invasion, combined with bad weather, a series of droughts that caused Guyana to go into a period of economic decline. And having been rich and powerful, they were envied and feared by others. And as soon as the decline started, as soon as they had smelled the blood of a wounded animal, Guyana was easy prey to the other tribes. And during the 12th and 13th centuries, they were systematically destroyed and they fell. The next state mentioned in your text is Mali. Now, Mali had her beginnings about the same time as Guyana, but remained small and insignificant until around 1240. Then under the rule of Sudinet Kina, they overran the former capital of Guyana, accepted the Muslim faith, and Guyana became, in effect, Mali. However, it would be roughly 70 years later, under a very successful leader called Mansa Musa, and a member of the Kinta dynasty, that the empire really did grow. And during this time, the Muslim religion also grew, and although the people were predominantly agricultural, there were those who did engage in trade, and the rulers had control of very profitable gold mines. And being good, pious Muslims, the rulers made their annual pilgrimages to Mecca, and it was during these pilgrimages they would check out the rest of their state. And there would be huge caravans filled with gifts to bestow along the way, and as well as in Cairo and Mecca. There would be thousands of people and hundreds of camels in these caravans. So the reputation of the wealth and power of Mali spread far and wide in West and North Africa. Now, when Mansa Musa died in 1337 era, Mali was extremely powerful and organized as a political state. Even years after his death, a traveling Arabian geographer reported how impressed he was with the discipline of the officials and the excellent condition of the people. And the finances were in excellent shape, he said. He said the respect of the people for their officials and the religiosity of the people was just phenomenal. Now, I want to remind you that at this time, the 12th century, the middle of the 1100s, Europe was no more nearly as organized or as wealthy as Mali. As a matter of fact, it was in American history what we call the history of the Dark Ages. It was backward, it was dirty, it was full of disease. So you've got this flowing religion with wealthy, educated people as compared to the Europeans who were basically swinging from trees. But as so often happens, in the 15th century, there were signs of decline starting to show. And as I said earlier, as a wounded animal is prey to those stronger, just as Mali had overrun Guyana, Now it was Mali's turn. The kingdom of Songhai began their attacks. Now Songhai had also begun, just as Ghana and Mali, as a small, inconsequential state. It was under the influence of the Mali for a time and actually vassals of the Mansa Musa. They bided their time, waiting for a weakness so they could make their move, which they did in 1355. Soni Ali became leader of Songhai in the 1460s, and he decided the time was ripe to conquer the Niger River region. How? Now, I know this sounds strange, but he built a navy, and he conquered both banks of the river. Sounds simple. Well, it was quite a warrior, and he succeeded very well. I mean, by 1469, he had control of the entire Niger River region and Mali. Now, some people weren't too happy about this because he wasn't Muslim. He spent his years of rule fighting to defend his rule. But when he died, Songhai was the dominant power in West Africa. However, a year after his death, his dynasty was overthrown by a general, Asi Muhammad. Now, Asi Muhammad ruled from 1493 to 1529, which is 26 years. And he was Songhai's most brilliant leader. And he began to use his energies to, shall we say, strengthen his empire and making the people of Songhai prosperous. And one of the programs he initiated was the encouragement of education. He began to build up his army, and he paid them professionally. And he used some former prisoners and as army, and he also let his people do their thing. They began a conquering campaign of the surrounding smaller states, which is something Napoleon's going to do a couple of hundred years later. Songhai soon became the largest and most powerful state in the history of Africa. And when Asi Muhammad would make his pilgrimages to Rome, to Mecca, he didn't do as some of the former rulers had done.